I'm a kid of the 1950s. I was raised back in Ohio right after World War II. So it's like I can think back to growing up as a kid in post, World War II, the United States. We were like in a technological renaissance after World War II. We were just filled with optimism, and we had incredible new technologies like supersonic airplanes, rockets, atomic bombs, television, and in the midst of all this was a fascination with flying saucers. And so that's the world I grew up with. The flying saucers seem to be a part of that, in that we were developing rockets to take humans into outer space. So it didn't seem that odd that extraterrestrials might in fact be visiting here from outer space. And so that just seemed to be a natural part of the 1950s. But I was raised to small town, Midwestern, middle class sensibilities, proprieties. And something in that mindset, something either was or it wasn't. It was just a simple, pragmatic Midwestern attitude. And it seemed like people all over the country were reporting seeing things like flying saucers, UFOs. And at the same time, the government was making these proclamations that there's no such thing as UFOs. UFOs are nonsense. People who see UFOs are crackpots. And it became a taboo, really, to talk about that. And it's like I could never understand that. I could never understand how, even as a small child, I couldn't understand what were the reasons that would make this topic unacceptable socially and politically. And that's a question I have been asking ever since, I was a little kid. I'm only 1 year younger than the UFO phenomenon itself. The original crash at Roswell was 1947. I was born a year later. So I've grown up with flying saucers. I've grown old with flying saucers. So here we are, nearly 70 years. I've lived with this phenomena for nearly 70 years, and it's like we still don't have definitive answers to it. So over the course of my life, I've been not so much interested in individual UFO contact experiences and sightings and so forth. My focus has become trying to figure out why this topic is still taboo, why we still do not have official governmental disclosure about the topic to this day. So as a kid, along with this fascination for flying saucers, I have to admit, I never saw one. Everybody was talking about them. Grown-ups seemed to be genuinely concerned that there was something strange flying around in our skies that couldn't be accounted for. But I never saw one. I always wanted to see one. But, and the disconnect was like the government was saying there's no such thing as UFOs. But Hollywood was selling science fiction movies filled with flying saucers. And so it's like my sensibilities, my love of the topic of flying saucers stems directly from Hollywood. We love the Hollywood movies. And I think my favorite science fiction movie as a kid was Earth versus the Flying Saucers. Because usually in the early science fiction movies, Hollywood would show just a little sneak peek of a flying saucer just to give you the idea of it. But then you wouldn't see it through the rest of the film, like The Day the Earth Stood Still. You saw the saucer land in Washington very briefly at the beginning of the film, but then you didn't see much of it during the rest of it. So, but Earth versus the Flying Saucers, I got my money's worth on that one, because it was flying saucers, attacking Washington and attacking, space launches, and so all through the movie. So I just love that. I loved, and that's where my fascination with flying saucers, not UFOs, flying saucers. I was fascinated with the technology of it. I wanted to see, and I still to this day want to see, a real deal flying saucer in broad daylight. I don't want to see the funny lights in the sky at night. That doesn't convince me of anything. But to see a real deal flying saucer, because I believe, and to this day I still believe, that there is a technology behind circular disc aircraft. That's legitimate. Speaking of Hollywood, and then as the films progressed on into the mid-50s, the production qualities became better. And I remember in 1956, they released the film Forbidden Planet, which was an MGM production, widescreen, cinemascope, Technicolor, blockbuster that was really, really ahead of its time for 1950s science fiction. And aside from the fact that it had a corny 1950s romance subplot and a lovable robot named Robbie running around in it, it had a very sophisticated storyline which showcased flying saucers flown by Earth humans. There was a saucer, they were showcasing Secret Space Fleet in 1956 where a fleet of flying saucers were able to use anti-gravity propulsion systems to fly into space. So this was astounding. And you got to understand that Hollywood is also part of the military-industrial complex. Hollywood does not exist as an independent entity. Hollywood showcases technologies and political agendas as entertainment, as fiction. But you got to understand, Hollywood is a creature of the military-industrial complex. So here you have Hollywood showcasing an anti-gravity flying saucer that's flown by an Earth military organization. So that was astounding in itself. And if you go back and watch the film again, the main character, Commander J.J. Abrams, is really a forerunner of Captain Kirk. The military protocols in Forbidden Planet were identical to the military protocols later on that Gene Roddenberry adapted for the Star Trek TV series. So it's like they're showcasing a secret space agenda, once again, as entertainment. And then also, the other thing that's become more apparent and more disturbing about Forbidden Planet is artificial intelligence. It was also selling the concept that artificial intelligence can be advanced to the point where it can exist independently of human race. And in the film Forbidden Planet, the crew goes to this planet called Altair 4 to seek out the what became of an expedition to that planet. And it turns out that there's only two survivors, a Dr. Morbius and his daughter Altera. And Dr. Morbius has discovered this ancient artificial intelligence engine that lives inside the planet, that is fully functional, fully independent, fully self-regulating, that has lasted for millions of years. And this machine, this artificial intelligence, is so sophisticated that if you tap your consciousness into it, it can project 3D images or 3D reality anywhere on the planet. So this is very, very sophisticated stuff for 1956. And you look at where AI and artificial intelligence is heading right now today, that film was very prescient in what it was showcasing. concurrent with the Forbidden Planet movie, all through the 50s, there was consistent talk coming from military, coming from defense contractors and so forth, that we were in fact on the cusp of developing anti-gravity flying machines. This was going to be the state-of-the-art military and propulsion advance that was being worked on ever since the end of World War II, and we were advancing it to the point where it was going to revolutionize air travel and space travel beyond your wildest imagination. In fact, one of my favorite magazine advertisements back in the 1950s was showed a picture of a mother and her daughter and their dog, and they're flying in this little flying saucer, getting ready to land in front of their little suburban ranch home. And I love that, because I thought, that's the world we're going to, in the next 20, 30 years, that's the reality we're going to be moving into, that we will have our own little flying cars. I honestly believe that. And the technology that was being talked about behind the scenes during the 1950s suggested that was imminent. That kind of technology was imminent. So right after 1956 and the Forbidden Planet, where they showed the big, beautiful silver disc flying saucer, the C-57D, the Air Force showcased its own flying saucer, another beautiful silver flying saucer that was called the Avro disc. And they dragged it out for the press cameras, and it did a little test flight around the tarmac there at this test facility, and this thing bobbled and wobbled and barely got off the ground. It could barely get off the ground and fly in circles around the tarmac area there. And the Air Force very loudly, very prominently said, this proves that there's no such thing as feasible circular aircraft technology. We can't get this thing to fly, therefore it is a waste of taxpayers' dollars. So we will discontinue this and have no more discussion about flying saucer machines for the Air Force. And they did. The Avro disc was summarily disbanded from the Air Force development projects and is now a relic in the Smithsonian Aerospace Museum. And there was no more talk. After that, no more talk about anti-gravity, about flying saucers being developed by the Air Force. It was a taboo topic. And from 1960 on, all we heard about was rockets, rockets, rockets. That brings us up to the 1960s, and UFOs and flying saucers really started to take a backseat to NASA and the American rocket program. And I got to tell you, it's like, looking back in the 1960s, we were absolutely obsessed with rocketry. They had established the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. That was Eisenhower's civilian space agency. And we had seen, earlier in the 50s, we had seen Wernher von Braun on Disney with animated speculation on how to build big rockets and get to the moon. And this is incredible. And by the 1960s, they were actually taking Wernher von Braun's theories and designs, and they were actually building it. They were building rockets that would put men in space. They were building rockets that promised to take men to the moon. And early in President John F. Kennedy's administration, he stated that the mandate that by the end of the decade, we would land men on the moon. And I can't tell you how thrilling and exciting that idea was, that I had been born into an era where we would see one of the oldest dreams of mankind actually come to fruition, to leave planet Earth and set foot on another world. That was like just incredibly astounding that I was actually going to live through this era. So we saw suborbital flights. We saw like Scott Carpenter's suborbital flight. The astronauts were like superstars. We knew the names of all the astronauts: Scott Carpenter, John Glenn, Neil Armstrong. They were like superstar heroes. And we saw suborbital flights. We saw John Glenn's orbital flight. We saw, then later we got into after the Mercury program, we got into the Gemini program, where we had orbital flights with the astronauts actually, walking in space. And of course, it all culminated in the 1969 launch to Apollo 11 launch to the moon. So this was like, you go back and watch the early James Bond movies with Sean Connery, and just about all of them are obsessed with, Secret Service protecting the space program. So it's like we saw that almost every night on the news. Pictures of rockets taken off from Cape Kennedy. And concurrent with that was the potential threat of an atomic war with the Russians. So there was also, the space race was not just about getting men into the moon, it was also a competition between the United States and the Soviet Union as to who would have the biggest and the most powerful and the most threatening rockets. So this is what the 1960s was just awash with this preoccupation, and the whole UFO thing got shunted off to the side. Not that it wasn't still going on, but it was not getting the public attention that the space race was. So the culmination of manned rocketry was going to be our Apollo 11 moon landing in 1969. But the year before that, Stanley Kubrick released his most incredible science fiction masterpiece, 2001: A Space Odyssey, which was, if you look back on it, considering the time frame and what was going on in the country, you could see that this 2001: A Space Odyssey was a huge PR send-off for the Apollo moon launch that was going to happen the following year. But what was interesting in the film story, 2001: A Space Odyssey, was an issue that was very, very significant with regard to the possibility of encountering an extraterrestrial reality through the course of our space activities. So the film 2001: A Space Odyssey is centered around the discovery of a huge black monolith on the moon. And of course we see that within the context of the film, we have a base on the moon, and we are shuttling, NASA directors back and forth to the moon, who are monitoring the activities of our space base there. But the dilemma that is showcased in 2001: A Space Odyssey is like, well, if we did discover an alien artifact, if we did discover proof of an extraterrestrial reality, would we share that information? Would we share that discovery with the general public? And within the context of the film, they came to the conclusion that the public is not yet ready to deal with facing the reality of an extraterrestrial presence. So they decided in the film to cover up knowledge of the artifact on the moon. Well, in point of fact, that was really, they were showcasing, once again, Hollywood and military-industrial complex is showcasing a very real attitude towards the discovery of extraterrestrial life. There was a study that was done by the Brookings Institute Brookings Institute, for NASA prior to our manned space launches, where it was a think tank where they got the best minds in science and philosophy and so forth, to postulate what would be the psychological effect on the general public if we did in fact encounter an extraterrestrial reality over the course of our space activities. And they concluded that the general public is still too medieval, too reactionary, too primitive to face the reality of an extraterrestrial presence. So if we did, the Brookings Institute recommended that if in fact we did encounter extraterrestrials, it would be best if we withheld that information from the public. So we get the seeds of cover-up showcased in 2001: A Space Odyssey, which was in fact the attitude and the policy of NASA at that same time. So the government policy was at the outset and remains to this day that nothing out of the ordinary exists.